Aloha, welcome. Let me have your attention, please. Let me have your attention, please. Be seated. Welcome to the East-West Center Research Program Speaker Series. Can I have your attention, please? We need to get started. Thank you. Thank you for the East-West Center Speaker Series is a recurring program that spotlights emerging developments throughout the region. Through this series, we explore environmental, demographic, political, and economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region in profound ways. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, but I'm going to introduce our esteemed president of the East-West Center, Celeste Connors, who will introduce our guest speaker today. Welcome.
Mahalo, Carlos, and aloha, everybody. It's so good to see everybody at the end of the week, some newer faces, and we've had quite a busy week here at the East-West Center, actually, with different things that we're discussing as we're meeting here on this really important topic. Victor, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Just up the road in Keone, we have the Young Trilateral Leaders Gathering happening with incredible young leaders from Japan and Korea and the United States, and they're looking at these key topics of cybersecurity and AI and digital connectivity. And I read all of their bios, and I just have to say that I feel deeply reassured to know that smart people like the Young Trilateral Leaders Gathering are going to be able to solve some of these really challenging issues. We were also delighted earlier this week to host Dr. Francis Fukuyama for a discussion about democracy, the state of the world, rule of law. And so it's just really wonderful to bookend this week with this conversation. And the book, which I don't see anybody, there we are, because I have my copy downstairs, and I encourage you all to actually read it. I hope that you're signing these copies, but aloha and welcome to the East-West Center. This is our research speaker series, as Carlos said, which really provides an opportunity for all of us and experts around the room to gather and really talk about these pressing issues. The demographics that are shaping and reshaping the Indo-Pacific. So today's conversation is on the weaponization of trade, and it's particularly timely. Economic security has become increasingly central to how we think about the region. It's been something that the East-West Center has actually traditionally focused on. And it's really about navigating the benefits of economic interdependence alongside growing concerns. We talked about supply chain dependencies, the use of economic relationships as leverage, political leverage. And so these are important questions for the East-West Center, for our adjuncts, for our staff, and for the broader regional community. How we build resilience while continuing to benefit from trade and economic integration, how partners and governments can work collectively to respond to economic pressure will have a significant implication on the region. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Victor Cha with us to help examine these issues. Victor is a longtime friend and colleague of the East-West Center. He was formerly a POSCO Fellow and today serves as one of our senior adjunct fellows. He's also a distinguished university professor and the DS Song KF Endowed Chair in Government and International Affairs at Georgetown University, president of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy Department and Korea Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He previously served at the NSC at the National Security Council as Director for Asian Affairs. I think we actually overlapped there, so delighted to have my former NSC colleague here, and has written 9 books on international affairs in the region. So Dr. Cha, Victor, is both a practitioner and an academic, a very unique thing to have here, which is wonderful. And his newest book, China's Weaponization of Trade, Resistance Through Collective Resilience Here, which he will discuss today. You know, he, in this book, examines hundreds of cases of economic coercion. He considers how countries can work together to build pressure against these types of actions. Dr. Cha, we are delighted to welcome you back to the East-West Center. I in particular, and all of us look forward to the discussion. Mahalo.
Well, thank you both, Celeste, and thank you, Carlos. for the kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I see lots of familiar faces around the room here. I was saying as I was coming in after parking that early in the mornings on the weekends, I come to the campus and I walk with my dog around the entire perimeter of the campus. And it like reminds us of different parts of our life. So we get to one part of the campus, and on the other side of campus is the Liahi Swim School, where my son, who is now 30 years old, learned how to swim when he was first here. And then he's done internships in Hawaii. Derek helped set up an internship with him with OHA. It's just been, so it's really a homecoming. So it's really nice to be back here with you and share some of the work that we've been doing at CSIS on this question of trade weaponization. I'm going to talk about it largely in the context of China, but I'm sure there will be questions that arise about other countries that might be weaponizing trade these days, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. So this, as Celeste said, is based on a book that came out earlier this year on China's weaponization of trade. I wrote it with two co-authors, Ellen Kim and Andy Lim, at the time, both at CSIS. So what I wanted to do is just take you through some of the basic arguments, some of the data in the book, and then we can have a conversation about it. And again, really, it's a pleasure to be back here at the East West Center. So if we could go to the first slide, that would be terrific. Oh, the next slide, yeah. So start out by, so many of you, who have spent time in Washington, D.C. know that it's a bit of a parlor game to try to take percentage bets on what the chances are that China will use military force across the Taiwan Straits by 2027. A date that will live in infamy for some reason. It's been talked about quite a bit. And, depending on who you ask, some people say 20%, some people say 50%. Some people say 60, 70%. I don't know the answer to this question, but I do know that there is a 100% chance that China will weaponize trade against different targets, governments, companies, individuals. In fact, as we speak today, China is weaponizing trade against Japan, right? For statements that the new Prime Minister Takaichi made, which were essentially a restatement of Japanese defense policy when it came to a potential conflict in the Taiwan Straits and how Japan might feel obligated to be involved in that conflict. China has since that statement carried out a bevy of economic sanctions against Japan, including curtailing rare earth minerals, stopping tourism, stopping students. There are a whole variety of things that they are doing, basically to try to get the Japanese Prime Minister to retract, again, what was essentially a restatement of basic Japanese defense policy. So just to define our terms, economic coercion is the use of non-market mechanisms to weaponize trade in order to exert influence on the sovereign choices of another state. Economic coercion is different from trade protectionism, right? Things that you might do you want to protect your industry, so you raise tariffs on a competing product from another country. That's protectionism. You can take that to the WTO for adjudication and a verdict can be rendered. The economic coercion is different, right? It's not trade protectionism. These are specific actions that are taken for the purpose of exerting political influence on a country, usually with regard to some statement about Taiwan, about Tibet, about human rights, about territorial disputes, about the legitimacy of the CCP, Xi Jinping, the list goes kind of on and on. China's economic coercion is not just a trade issue. It is an issue that relates to peer competition and arguably the resilience of the liberal international order, or what's left of the liberal international order, in the sense that when we think of economic coercion, it's a targeted action against one government or one company or one individual, but it has broader ramifications because it causes everybody else who is watching that to say, I don't want to be that target, right? And it causes them to then self-censor their actions, whether it's talking about democracy, whether it's talking about Tibet, Taiwan, territorial dispute, freedom of navigation, the South China Sea, whatever the issue may be, there is a self-censorship effect that happens as a result of every act of economic coercion that China undertakes. So it's much broader than simply a bilateral action, although most of the actions taken by China tend to be bilateral. Next slide, please. So what we've done in this book is we've done a couple of things. So the first thing is we tried to get a handle on the universe of cases when it comes to China's weaponization of trade. More often than not, as I'll talk about in a minute, these actions tend to be informal. They tend to be unannounced. And so for that reason, many of the targets of China's economic coercion, sometimes they don't even know they're being coerced. Like it takes time for them to understand they're being coerced. And when they realize it, they usually don't want to talk about it because they don't want to escalate the situation. Like China's carrying out coercion against one company with regard to one product. If the target starts talking about this, their concern is it may escalate. China may expand the coercion. So it's very hard to get companies, governments to talk about this, aside from some of the well-known cases. So what me and my co-authors and a research team did was we basically scraped the data to find every known case of Chinese economic coercion that we could find. We came up with over 600 cases. Our belief is it's the largest data set available in terms of China's economic coercion. Up until this point, the most robust data set we saw was about 200 cases. So this is triple that number. And this research has been going on for about 3.5, 4 years. And I'm proud to say that we did this without AI. We did this all grinding it all out, our RAs. So over 600 cases, 18 countries, 470 companies. The first case that we could identify was in 1997. And that was with regard to the Chinese not allowing the movie 7 Years in Tibet to screen in China, starring Brad Pitt, because it was about Tibet. But very clearly, the frequency of cases heightens under Xi Jinping. Like this really heightens during Xi Jinping's time in office. So if you go to the next slide, so this is, this is impossible for you to see, but the people online are able to see it. This is basically a breakdown of the known cases of coercion against firms. Again, the thing to point out here is by far the most coerced or the most targeted in terms of firms are American companies. There are 278 cases. Then it's Japan, almost 60 cases. Then South Korea, Taiwan, and the list goes on and on. You can see that it's not just countries in the Indo-Pacific, it's certainly countries in Europe. It's most, if not all of the G7 countries have been targeted. And then there's a whole list of other countries at the very bottom of the list where there have been one or two cases. If we go to the next slide. So this is kind of the next slide is kind of a word map of all the companies that have been targeted. The ones at the outer end in black have been targeted once. The ones in blue have been targeted twice. The ones in red have been targeted 3 times, and the one in the green has been targeted 4 times. And you can see by the names of the companies, the ones that have been targeted multiple times, many of them are US companies, they're US defense companies. And I'm sure that in part relates to things with regard to arms sales to Taiwan. But Apple has been by far the most coerced company of those targeted by China. And so part of the reason for doing this exercise is not just an academic one to create a unique data set, but it is also a way to message to companies and countries around the world that we're all in this together, right? When a country or a company gets targeted, they feel like they are alone and completely isolated. And again, they don't want to talk about it. They immediately go to the Chinese, whether it's the consul general or the embassy, and say, what can we do to apologize? You know, what can we say? What can we do? We didn't mean to harm the feelings of the Chinese people. And in more cases than not, with some of these companies, the Chinese actually draft a public apology that is then posted by the CEO of the company on Facebook or some website. And you know it was written by the Chinese because of the way it was written. Like you would never expect like the CEO of Versace to write something like this. But they feel like they're completely alone and isolated. And part of the point of this word map is to show that you're not alone, right? That there are a whole bunch of companies that are have been or are being coerced by China. So if we go to the next slide. So the nature of this coercion, and the caveat here is that these are some of the traits, but it is changing. China is changing their tactics. The nature of this coercion, it tends to be, as I said, informal and unannounced. Part of the reason that they do this is for plausible deniability. Another reason, presumably, is that if the coercive action doesn't work, then they're not embarrassed by it. But there, at least in recent years, the lengths to which they will go to make sure that there is no paper trail is really quite astounding. So there was very interesting research, not done by us, but done by two scholars looking at China's economic coercion against Norway for the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident writer. After they did that, all of a sudden, China stopped importing Norwegian salmon. So it was basically sitting on the docks rotting, while the import of Scottish salmon went up exponentially and things. And what these scholars did was they were able to trace how the Chinese implemented this directive. And they did it without using a single piece of paper. It was all done through phone calls, face-to-face meetings with customs authorities in China saying like, you know, do not leave the Norwegian salmon on the dock, right? So they do everything they can to make it informal and unannounced. It's non-WTO conforming. So in the sense that if all of a sudden China decides that they're not sending group tours to South Korea to attend the 2019 Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, it's a deliberate economic coercive act, but it's not one you can really take to the WTO, right? I mean, it's not an obvious trade protectionist, unfair trading practice. And so there are a number of things like this that China does. There's doxing campaigns on social media. There are all these sorts of things that really don't fall within the framework of the WTO. Often, and I would caveat this is changing, but there is not a legal basis for the action. So it's, it's not an action taken in compliance with a UN Security Council resolution or a WTO ruling or even a domestic law. It's often just done arbitrarily and directly in response to something they don't like some government or company did. And so in that sense, there's no real like basis for the interaction that you can point to, although I would say that that's changing. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not over market access or fair trade. These are very targeted actions to try to change the sovereign political choices that states are making with regard to relations with Taiwan or over the South China Sea or over freedom of navigation operations, FONOPS, or whatever, whatever it is. This is not about trade. And more often than not, it's for political purposes. So this is the problem, right? This is the problem that we're dealing with. And if we go to the next slide, we have to think about, and so we know that China does this. How do we deal with this? And so the one measure that gets the most attention and that the governments have been most focused on is what's popularly known as de-risking, right? Basically trying to protect supply chains from China's ability to disrupt those supply chains. So this is in the form of reshoring or friendshoring, right? So that's moving production chains out of China back to your home country or to friendly governments where you don't have to worry about disruption. Impact mitigation is another one. Impact mitigation is essentially the idea of trying to help a country that has been targeted by China's economic coercion. During the Morrison government, the Scott Morrison government in Australia, the Australian government called for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID. So outside of the World Health Organization, given China's dominance in the World Health Organization. The Chinese responded by carrying out a massive economic coercion campaign against Australia. Some of you may remember this, like massive attack tariffs on Australian beef, barley, and wine, right? Secretary Pompeo was going out saying, all Americans go buy Australian wine. What some countries did was they practiced trade diversification. So they said, we're going to buy more Australian beef. We're going to buy more Australian wine to try to blunt the effect of China's economic coercion. Another example of this was when Lithuania decided to open a Taiwan economic and cultural representative office, and they called it Taiwan, right? They didn't call it Taipei. They called it Taiwan office. The Chinese response was to heavily sanction Lithuania and to threaten to sanction all EU countries that exported products to China that had Lithuania in the supply chain. The other thing they did was that they canceled a big order of Lithuanian pianos. And so impact mitigation was others, individuals, companies, others said, okay, we're going to buy all those pianos. Like, we're going to buy them all instead of China. So that's kind of what impact mitigation is. So these are all under the broad, and of course, the ones you're most familiar with is what's being done on critical minerals, on semiconductors, right? These are the very important batteries, right? These are the very important cases. But all of these fall into this category of de-risking. And de-risking is important. It needs to be done, 100%, it needs to be done. But what it really does is it protects against the last act of Chinese economic coercion. Right? De-risking tends to be very reactive. So if China went after, and I can't remember which it is, someone can correct me, when China went after I think it was light rare earths to Japan in 2010 over a territorial dispute. Japan de-risked. They went on a 10-year campaign to reduce their reliance on, like, they reduced it from 80% to 50%. So, they addressed that supply chain. So what is China doing now? They are curtailing the export of heavy rare earths to Japan, right? So de-risking basically insulates you against the last act of Chinese economic coercion, not the next act of Chinese economic coercion. So it is a necessary but not sufficient measure to try to deal with China's economic coercion. The other alternative to trying to deal with China's economic coercion is to decouple. Right, that's the other choice. Just don't trade with China. Right, but the second largest economy in the world, like huge consumer middle class, it's very difficult for countries to say, I'm going to completely decouple trade from China. Right, it would be at huge cost. That's not to say decoupling doesn't exist. We certainly saw it during the Biden administration when Jake Sullivan talked about the small yard, high fence. He was talking about a handful of things where basically the United States was making the decision to decouple, right? In semiconductor chips, in quantum computing, in EV batteries, like there was a decision to organize allies and basically decouple from China. but broadly speaking, it's very impractical, if not unfeasible to completely decouple from China, right? So the policy problem is, how do you continue to trade with China while stopping the economic coercion, right? I mean, how do you continue to trade with China? You can continue to de-risk, you can't decouple. How do you trade with China? How do you encourage healthy, rules-based, trade with China without them constantly using economic coercion because of something you said or something your diplomat did, or whatever it might be, right? And so next slide. This is where we have come up with this idea of collective resilience. And so the simplest way to explain it, given the time constraints, is it's essentially in Article 5 for collective economic deterrence. It's a notion that a group of countries will come together and they say, use economic coercion against any one of us, we will retaliate, right? So it's a threat of collective retaliatory sanctioning on China's high dependence goods to deter the weaponization of trade. And sort of in that third bullet, the key phrase there is China's high dependence goods. So if we go to the next slide. So what we've done is that we have tried to comprehensively map, and this is just goods trade, right? This is just merchandise trade. We have tried to comprehensively map all of China's trade vulnerabilities with its trading partners when it comes to not services, but just goods. And in this case, this slide these are the 18 governments that have been targeted by China's economic coercion. And of those 18 governments, we found that there are 589 items of Chinese high dependence. So Chinese high dependence means they get at least 70% of their total imports of a particular good from one country, right? And then valued at about $43 billion. And then you can see high dependence of 90%. There are 259 items where China is more than 90% dependent on one country for the import of that particular good. If you go to the next slide, just for the time here, again, it's hard to see this, but this just gives you a breakdown by country. The thing to note here is that Japan has by far the most high dependence imports, Chinese high dependence imports, than the United States, then Germany, and then the list goes on and on. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Palau at the bottom have been targets of Chinese economic coercion, but they don't have any high dependence goods. So they're in there in spirit, but they don't have much in terms of capabilities. If we could skip the next slide. And skip the next slide. Yeah, okay, good. So, you have these high dependence items, like how many of these things really matter? So we found out a lot of trivial data when we did this. So one of the things we found is that China is highly dependent on the import of high quality ballpoint pens from Japan. Obviously, if Japan were to curtail the export of ballpoint pens to China, it's not really going to make a dent, right? I once told this fact to a Japanese diplomat I was having lunch with in DC, who was serving in DC, and then he emailed me the next day because he had served in China. And he goes, Victor, when I thought about it, when I was in the embassy in Beijing, like every pen I used was a Japanese pen. It wasn't, it was nothing else but Japanese. China is highly dependent, we found, on high quality suitcases from Germany. But if Germany were to curtail that export, China could easily substitute for that, right? But there are some things we found that are more interesting. So in this list, for example, if you look at the third item, silver powder, China is dependent, 85% dependent on the import of silver powder from Japan. The next major importer is the United States at 10%. And the next one after that is Taiwan at 2.5%. If you put that all together, that's nearly 100% of China's silver powder is imported from 3 like-minded countries who have all been targets of Chinese economic coercion. And they use silver powder used in photovoltaic and electronic conductive paste for their solar panels, right? If we go to the next slide, this is high dependent imports from Korea. The very first item there, OLED panel displays that are used for smartphones, televisions, monitors, laptops, other electronic devices. Almost, 94% of that is imported from Korea. The next 3.5% is from Japan, and the next 2% is from Taiwan. So if you put that together, that's nearly 100%. Again, all from like-minded countries who have been targeted by China's economic coercion. So we skip to the next slide. This is just another graphic that displays this. If we can skip to the next slide. So there are quite a number of items where China is highly dependent, and these things are important to China. The other thing we tried to do is estimate how easily China could replace, if the imports were stopped, how they could replace this with domestic production. And so we tried to find different metrics to measure their domestic capacity to produce some of these items. And to make a long story short, this is basically a ratio. So this is an example using their self-reported exports of these high dependence items over their self-reported imports. The idea being that if they had exponentially more of these things that they were exporting than importing, they could easily replace a curtailment of exports. As you can see, the ratio on most of these is less than 1, right? Meaning they are not exporting much of this and they are heavily reliant on imports. Of course, they could adjust, they could structurally adjust and try to create more domestic capacity, but that creates transaction costs, right? And part of this deterrence strategy is you want to create transaction costs, because right now there are no costs to China for carrying out this economic coercion, none at all, right? There are none, and certainly no real economic costs. Okay, if we could skip to, if we go to the next slide, next slide. Right. And so what we did was, so we have all this data on the different capabilities of countries. The 18 governments themselves that we started with that were targeted, that's fine, but these are not like-minded countries. So we started trying to cut the data in different ways to look at what combination of capabilities and like-mindedness would make the strongest coalition, right? And so where we ended up was with G7 plus 2, right? So the G7 countries plus Australia and South Korea, right, have sizable capabilities to carry out a collective economic deterrence strategy. Like-minded countries, again, all part of either as guests or members of the G7, all targeted by China, and all of them signing on to different G7 leader statements, starting with Hiroshima and working forward, where they've all said that China's economic coercion is something that the G7 countries not just need to protect against, that means de-risking, but also to deter, right? To stop the coercion. But of course, that's not the entire universe of countries. So the other thing we looked at was the top 10 destinations for Chinese overcapacity, right? And so this is a list of those countries. If you go to the next slide. And so again, this is just a sample of countries, Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, and India. If we go to the next slide, and the next slide, and the next slide. So this is just an example. Brazil, They absorb about $13 billion in Chinese overcapacity. And they have a number of high dependence goods. And so one here is ferroniobium, where China is 96% dependent, which is needed an alloying agent for high strength steel. So part of the reason of looking at the overcapacity is it starts to bring countries in that are not necessarily like-minded with the United States and who China might look to as alternative sources of supply, right? This is essentially the idea. We can certainly talk about the political challenges of implementing a strategy like this, right? It's not going to be easy. But let me conclude by saying, if you could go to the last slide, keep going. Yeah, so the last slide is, just to close, like this is, again, the issue is, we don't want a trade war with China, right? We are trying to avoid a trade war with China, right? Deterrence, nuclear deterrence is not about starting a nuclear war. Nuclear deterrence is about stopping a nuclear war. And as I said, the problem here is that, China has been engaging in this pathological behavior since 1997, but every country needs to and wants to continue trading with China. And so we're de-risking to deal with this pathological behavior. We're de-risking. We can't or do not want to decouple, and we want to promote healthy trade with China. So what can we do to discourage this very sort of deviant behavior and to encourage like healthy trade with China? And so this is not in lieu of supply chain resilience. It's not in lieu of de-risking. It is in lieu of decoupling, but it is a strategy, again, that is about deterrence. If this strategy works, you would never have to use it. Just like nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence works if you never have to use nuclear weapons. It fails when you use nuclear weapons. It's the same thing with this strategy. It's designed not to be used. I know people may find it provocative and they may be very skeptical, but there is one theory of the case out there, and that is something called the anti-coercion instrument, right? This was something that the Europeans came together on after China used economic coercion against Lithuania and threatened secondary sanctioning against the entire EU market. They came together to create the anti-coercion instrument, which was effectively a deterrent strategy, saying to China, if you do countries, we're going to respond. We're not going to tell you what we're going to do, but we're going to respond. And so in the research and in the presentation of this, I made many trips to Europe, speaking to trade associations and things. Thus far, I've not been able, so the ACI was announced in Christmas week of 2023, I think. And as far as I could find thus far, nobody can give me a case of Chinese economic coercion on the scale of Lithuania since 2023. So there is a theory of the case out there. And in that sense, the Europeans are actually are more organized than the United States and our Indo-Pacific partners on this thus far, which also was something very interesting that I didn't expect to see. So with that, thank you for listening. Thank you everyone here for listening and for everybody online, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And as we turn now, we've got some in the audience, and I'm going to be alternating to take some online. But let me open it first to right here, getting started here. And please introduce yourself so we'll know. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me ask you to press the button on the middle there, right there, that one.
Yeah, so people online can hear.
Try again. Look for a red button to come on. There you go. Okay. Now it's active.
Okay, my name's Mark Wall. I think you've helped me understand a contradiction, at least in my own mind, about how a country whose economy is kept afloat by its export industries you know, how a country that could be so dependent on international markets be able to get away with playing such economic hardball. And I think you've answered it by saying it's very subtle, it's not public, it's, you know, they pick off individual companies and they're too afraid to speak out. So, and your answer to that is collective resilience, to use China's dependency on international markets against it. But maybe you can elaborate more on two of the problems in actually implementing this. And one is a problem that you run into when countries try to boycott goods or do export controls. You've got to get enough of other countries involved for it to be successful. And the other problem that, you know, and you've touched on this a bit, but China has such enormous industrial capacity on its own. It's going to be able to substitute through its own means for a lot of these goods, as dependent as it may be now. I mean, we're pursuing sanctions or restrictions on sales of semiconductors. That's not going to last much longer. And they're going to be able to make the lithograph machinery that they get from Holland pretty soon. So how do you deal with these two problems? Rounding up enough countries where collective resilience can actually work. And how do you deal with the issue of China being able to develop its own capacities to respond?
Right. Thanks. Thanks very much for the questions. Could we go back? Could we pull up the slide deck again? So, you know, we've been able to describe in this work what the problem is pretty comprehensively and what the capabilities are, right? The hardest part of all this is the political will, right? Pulling everyone together. If we like our initial grouping was 18 governments who have been targeted by China's economic coercion. If they were to pull together in a collective resilience coalition, the first thing that China would do would be to look for the weakest country in that coalition and target that country and really test whether the United States, Japan, Germany would really come to the aid of that country, right? So, so undeniably, this is not an easy challenge. It requires certainly the lead by big countries, right? And right now, frankly, the United States, we're really not in a position to lead on something like this because we're out there doing our own version of economic coercion. But it requires the big economies, you know, the US, Japan, Germany among them, to come together. You have to discourage free riding, right? So, you know, they target Lithuania. Japan says that's not my problem. That's Germany's problem. Like, you can't have that sort of free riding because then the whole thing just falls apart. So it's pulling together coalition. So how do you pull them all together? I would say there are two things. One is, as you know well, right, policy choices that governments make are not in absolute terms, right? They can look at this and say, oh, like, this is really bad. China might come in. It's always in relative terms, right? So the question to potential members of this coalition is, you can do this, or you can do what you're doing now, which is nothing, which means you're going to live under the shadow of China's economic coercion forever. And you can de-risk, right? Like playing whack-a-mole, you can de-risk on every, try to de-risk on every item. But China's gonna, you know, be able to hold you to account with critical minerals forever. So the choice is, you can try this or you can do nothing, right? The second is that if you can go back, slide back, a couple of more slides, keep going, like this, right? All right, so if we look at here, this is just, these are some of China's high dependence imports. If we were to like ask Japan to be part of this coalition, the idea is not that in this deterrence strategy, if China were to economically coerce one of the countries, that Japan would have to leverage all 159 high dependence items. That's basically destroying their trade relationship with China. It would be basically be asking, like, pick two. Like, pick two. The United States, you pick two. You know, Germany, you pick three. And we don't disclose what this is publicly, but this is sort of our toolkit of what we could use. And we convey publicly that there is a toolkit of countermeasures that we could use in concert if China weren't. So my point is that the burden on each country to be a member is not that high. There's clearly a risk because if China sees who's in that coalition, they may target them. But like the alternative is they're going to target you anyway, right? And then on your second point about substitution costs, yes, China has tremendous capacity. Probably at some point or another, if something like silver powder were cut off from China, they would find a way through alternative markets or something, or domestic production to try to replace that. And they might be able to do that. It might take them some time, and it will certainly cost them something to do that. And so the other part of a deterrence strategy is you're just trying to impose costs so that they think twice about carrying out this action. If they think that carrying out some sort of coercion, they know they're going to suffer costs in terms of finding alternative suppliers or having to rejigger their domestic industry, those are now new costs that are part of a economic coercion calculation that were not there before, right? As I said, China can stop importing Norwegian salmon. It's no cost to them. They just import salmon from Scotland. And it's not like there's going to be civil society protests in China, in response to like the cutting off of something. So right now there are no costs, and this is a strategy. It's an imperfect strategy, but it's one that tries to convey that there are costs now to China. The other type of elements that we included in the high dependence imports were, there are a bunch of intermediate goods, finished goods, but we also included luxury goods because there's a political cost associated with luxury goods, right? And so China is almost 100% dependent on fine whiskeys from the UK and fine brandies from France, and almost 100% dependent on both frozen and non-frozen lobster from Canada, right? These again are they are not critical items, but they are luxury goods that could impose a political cost on China. So we're just trying to find a way to impose some sort of cost on their calculation about economic coercion.
Well, let me turn to one question we have online. It comes from Marius Panajon. How can the Philippines apply your concept of collective resilience when economic dependence on China intersects with maritime pressure in the West Philippine Sea and Philippine Rise and emerging narratives questioning Philippine sovereignty over Batanes? Can ASEAN and like-minded partners create an effective deterrent against such multidimensional coercion without requiring economic decoupling from China?
Well, so my answer is it's kind of similar to the last answer, which is particularly for smaller countries like the Philippines and others that are heavily dependent on trade with China. I guess my question to the question would be, okay, what is your strategy? Right? I mean, right now, your strategy basically is to keep China happy, right? And if China is to coerce on something like bananas, as they did with the Philippines, you're going to try to do everything you can to stop that sort of economic pressure. And you're all by yourself, right? You're all by yourself. Being part of a coalition with bigger countries where they all reassure each other that they're going to work together to try to deal with this problem. Again, in terms of relative policy choices, that to me sounds like a better policy choice. But undeniably, it requires a lot of trust, a lot of confidence in the lead powers to be willing to underwrite this effort. And, that kind of leadership is missing right now.
Let's turn over here. Please, Celeste.
Forum hopping and move it out of WTO. coupled with what you said about, surprisingly to you, EU countries taking more of a deliberate action. I recall in your book, though, you said Germany was a little bit weaker in the knees when it came to Lithuania and what happened with Taiwan. So if collectively were to do this, is sort of that G7+2 pathway look credible if you were to kind of build a more steady trajectory with US, Germany, UK, and really start to flesh out this idea? I mean, are you getting any traction with some initial conversations and people's appetite to do that?
Yeah. So, so the reason we ended up on the G7+2 was we were first looking for the most like-minded coalition we could find that had substantial capabilities, right? And kind of that's what emerged in the end. And then when we looked at the G7, we saw there clearly is a history there of them recognizing this problem and wanting to do something about it. The challenge with this, there are two challenges. One is, so this is, at least I think, I don't know about my co-authors, but I think like this is the forum, right? This is the forum in which to do it. There are two challenges. One is that there's not necessarily consistency, and you know this well, Celeste, there's not necessarily consistency in terms of who the hosts invite outside the G7 to participate. And so, for example, at the last G7, South Korea was in Evian, but Australia wasn't, right? And then the second issue is that the host, as you know well, decides the agenda, and there was relative consistency from Japan to Canada in terms of economic security and not just protecting, but trying to do something to stop China's economic coercion. Then it went to Italy and it kind of dropped off the agenda, right? And so trying to ensure that it consistently stays on the agenda is important. The data on overcapacity, I think, is interesting because there's a possibility to expand at least the conversation to the G20, right? Because there are many countries in the G20 that are not necessarily like-minded, that have suffered Chinese economic coercion and are suffering an overcapacity problem. And so, that's clearly a much harder group to organize, but you could at least begin a conversation on recognizing, is there, there is clearly an overcapacity problem, and is there a way to think about how to organize with regard to that? So these, I think these are kind of the two forums. And in the sporadic interaction I've had with our government about it, it's largely been outreach from folks who are working on these two forums that have showed some, some who have read some of the work. So yeah.
Let's turn to Denny. I think we had a question.
Victor, thanks for a great presentation. In security studies of China's foreign policy, outside experts often cite this principle that China is more likely to be tougher on US-aligned weaker countries than on a powerful country like the United States. South China Sea is a good example. But your data seems to find that in the economic realm, that's flipped, because the majority of coercive actions were taken against the United States, pretty strong majority, right? So that's an interesting difference, considering that China is heavily dependent on the United States for markets and technology and so on. The United States has a tremendous amount of economic leverage, but yet China is more willing to be tougher. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So, I mean, you're right. It is important. It's an important point. The only answer that I have to that is that, and we found this when we were doing the research. I mean, it was extraordinary to us that these 18 governments had substantial capability, and China is certainly aware of this, and they continue to carry out economic coercion because they know that no single country on its own is going to retaliate, right? They even the United States, I think, up until Donald Trump, they didn't think that there would be retaliation. And so the fact that, and China's aware of these trade vulnerabilities because, again, we've been doing this over 3 to 4 years. We use the UN Comtrade database, and you can see over the years as we map the vulnerabilities, China's clearly trying to reduce their vulnerabilities. Like they are, like on Japan, they are trying very hard to reduce their vulnerabilities. So they're aware of the vulnerabilities, and yet they carry out this coercion with confidence that no single country is going to respond. And they're probably right, that no single country will respond. But if a group of countries come together and say, there are going to be costs if you do this again, you know, that would certainly change the way China thinks about how they use economic coercion and under what circumstances and conditions. Yeah. Jim had a question too.
Jim.
Hey, Victor.
Hey.
Great fun, good presentation,
Hey,
big
thanks.
topic. One thing that strikes me is we all start paying attention because of the chokeholds, the rare earths and things that China could really squeeze our economies with. And guess what? That's going to disappear in the next 3 to 5 years as we, the Japanese, the Europeans, everybody pours money into finding new sources, developing new refining capacity. So that's going to disappear. And then after that, you get to a situation where, oops, China is much more dependent on the external trade than any of the individual countries it's trading with. So this is just a comment saying, yeah, we collectively are going to be in the driver's seat if we know how to use it at all. We can change Chinese behavior to an extent that we haven't had the capacity to before because of the chokeholds.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's an important point. I mean, you said 3 to 5 years. I've heard 5 to 10 years. I'm not an expert on that. I don't know. Yeah, it's like, but it's an important point. I mean, I think the other thing though is that as those points of leverage disappear for China, they will look for new points of leverage. And so a strategy like this still is important because, you know, again, like this, I mean, we're doing it too right now, but basically, you know, these things are destroying the liberal trading order, like completely destroying, everything is being weaponized and destroying the liberal trading order. So, you know, is there a corrective to this that while we're still protecting supply chains, de-risking, doing impact mitigation, even decoupling, is there a way to get us back on a path where people stop weaponizing the trade? And let me just directly address the U.S. issue. So when I look at what the United States has been doing, some of what we're doing is economic coercion by our definition, but some of it isn't. So, and like the Liberation Day tariffs, for example, right, against the entire world, according to our definition, that is actually not economic coercion. That is trade protectionism, right? The 15%, 20%, whatever you want to call it, this is the gap between what Trump believes is the overall average global tariff rate and what he thinks the U.S. average tariff rate is. Like I've heard people who staff him say this. And it comes out to about, the gap is about 15 to 20%. That's how you get the Liberation Day tariffs. But that's a protectionist tariff. But when he called for 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico for immigration and for fentanyl, that's economic coercion, right? Because that's not about trade. And so unsurprisingly, you know, my recommendation, and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post the week that we went to APEC, was that Trump should stop tariffing our allies and should pull them together in a coalition to address the real source of economic coercion in the global trading system, and that's China. He didn't listen, so.
Let me turn to one we have online that comes to us from Kotaro Abe from JBIC. So that's the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. So it's in the future that he's joining us. He's got a two-part question. First, in your 2023 paper, Collective Resilience, one proposed response to China's weaponization of economic interdependence was for Western countries to preserve areas where China remains dependent on them. What products or technologies do you think could serve as crucial leverage today? And the second part, weaponizing economic dependence may create short-term political leverage, but it can also accelerate diversification over the long term, as Japan did by increasing rare earth imports from Australia and developing resource-saving technologies. To what extent do you think China expects this risks when using economic coercion?
Yeah, so so these are some of these things sort of come up in the last chapter of the book. So if you were to think about implementing a strategy like this, what are some of the requisite things that you need to do? One for sure is our intel community or our allied intel community really need to do like universal mapping of not just what are China's current trade vulnerabilities, but actually thinking forward what might be future trade vulnerabilities. And so that's something that clearly needs to be done. I understand that in the previous administration, there was an effort like this that was underway in the economist's office to try to start collecting, mapping all of this. And my understanding is it was a fairly new effort, that it had not really been done before. So that's definitely something that has been done. All of our data, so our data for the 2023 article is on the Harvard Dataverse website, so you can see all of the things that we have listed, everything from like copper wire to ballpoint pens, like a whole list of things. But it's obviously not about the future, right? So that constantly needs to be done. And the second part of the question was, I'm getting harder and harder at remembering two-part questions. I will say that when initially we started doing this research and I gave presentations about what we were trying to do, I was either getting laughed out of or screamed out of the room. People are like, "You're trying to start a trade war. This is what happens when security guys do political economy. You just want to blow up the trading order." I have to tell you that now, 4 years later, that's not the reception anymore. I gave this presentation. I was invited to give it at Keidanren in Japan. Like 50 Japanese companies, all of their economic security people, the German Federation of Industries, like everybody understands that this is a problem that they don't have an answer for. So
I did find it at long last. It was buried in the answered question, but basically it was kind of following up about does China expect this risk when they're considering it?
Yeah.
The idea that short-term political leverage.
Yes. Well, so this also goes to the points that Jim and Ambassador Wall made, which is, yes, as soon as a strategy like this is implemented, China will start adjusting to it or preemptively adjusting to it. And so, and they will try to reduce their vulnerabilities on silver powder, OLED panel displays, fine whiskeys. They'll do all of that stuff. But the thing is, what this means is that there is now a cost to carrying out economic coercion. And deterrence is also it's all about imposing costs, right? It's all about imposing costs for behavior that you do not want them to undertake. And so that's all I can say is that they may try to reduce their vulnerabilities. We will have to look for new vulnerabilities. That's about all that we can do is create costs.
Well, thank you. I think on that note, we're going to bring closure to this. So thank you very much for this opportunity to hear remarks on your latest book. I want to thank the audience for attending, and we had many online as well. Remind you as well, the YouTube recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, and stay tuned for continued next events here at our East West Center events webpage. Thank you again, Dr. Shah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.